Open your eyes and see the truth of our plight and condition. Look at the profound changes within the African American culture. 60 years ago, we called ourselves brothers and sisters. Today, we're now calling ourselves niggers and bitches. We once agreed that white oppressive forces were in fact our worst enemies. Now, many insist that it's ourselves that are our worst enemies. During the 1960s, Black unified protests was unprecedented and it still remains unrivaled by any other group in U.S. history. However, today, we're now more divided than any previous time in history. During the 1960s, we also declared that Black is beautiful. We were proud of our African heritage, and we wore afros and African braids. Today, many of us are now totally ashamed of our African heritage. We bleach our skins, chemically alter our hair, and we're wearing European weaves. These changes and the current self-deprecating behavior within the African American culture are the deliberate result of negative social engineering by the white society. The African American culture has been negatively socially engineered by the white society. The hidden reason: while studying the African American culture to gain an understanding of the 1960s unprecedented unified Black protests, white social scientists learned that the emergence of the Black Pride movement elevated the collective self-esteem of the Black masses and resulted in millions of African Americans calling ourselves brothers and sisters. Doing so had a profoundly unifying effect upon the African American culture, which significantly contributed to that decade's unprecedented unified Black protests. Those white social scientists also learned then, while studying the African American culture, that while the white society, through their weaponry advantage of guns and cannons, can brutally invade and enslave we Africans, they, however, cannot win our loyalty or sustain peace with us indefinitely unless our collective minds have been manipulated to think in ways that prevents us from seeking retribution against the white society. Because whenever people are oppressed for long durations, their collective aggressions toward their oppressors will continue to grow until it reaches a boiling point, resulting in massive acts of rebellions against their oppressors. The oppressed always eventually rebels against their oppressors. This is an inherent response within the collective human psyche whenever people are kept under long-term oppression. This is what was actually happening amongst the African American population during the 1960s. White racism had reached a boiling point within the collective minds of the African American population, which resulted in that decade's unprecedented unified Black protests. Those white social scientists logically determined that they could subdue unified Black protests by deploying an ideological subversion system against the entire African American population. Ideological subversion is an offensive psychological warfare tactic that uses misinformation and deception as a weapon to change a people's behavior and beliefs in ways that are against their own interests and in ways that serve the interests of their enemies. Through this ideological subversion system, the African American culture was steered away from calling ourselves brothers and sisters, which unified us, to now calling ourselves niggers and bitches, which actually divides us. We were changed from knowing that white oppressive forces are our worst enemies to now perceiving that it's ourselves that are our worst enemies. This ideological subversion system also keeps the collective self-esteem of the Black masses very low, and it keeps our collective aggression shifted away from the white society and redirected towards ourselves by perpetually keeping us believing the fraudulent worst narratives about ourselves. Doing so demoralizes, divides us, and turns us against ourselves. Those white social scientists also determined that many African Americans had developed an allegiance towards Africa that impeded and hindered the growth of our patriotism towards the U.S., and that it was a contributing factor to the unprecedented Black protests of the 60s also. It was largely determined that African Americans' allegiance towards Africa had to be eroded. They determined that they could erode African Americans' allegiance towards Africa by turning Africa into a source of shame and humiliation for African Americans. To achieve this, white propagandists started constantly subjecting African Americans to seeing only images of war-torn, famine-ridden, rapidly illiterate, and disease-stricken Africa. By only showing the poorest parts of Africa, this made African Americans embarrassed about their heritage. And it subliminally conveys the message that we African Americans are the lucky ones to have been taken away from the backwardness of Africa. And therefore that we should be grateful to the white society for enslaving our ancestors. This constant humiliation erodes millions of African Americans' allegiance towards Africa and makes us feel grateful that slavery happened. Many now say, I'm happy slavery happened because it took us away from the backwardness of Africa. Many of African Americans have been made to feel indebted to the white society for enslaving our ancestors. This increased black allegiance to the U.S. Some African Americans have been so heavily demoralized by the humiliation depiction of Africa that they'll now accept any fable premise that allows them to claim themselves as being anything other than African. This is why so many African Americans have embraced the false narrative that they're not Africans, although countless millions of us have taken DNA analysis that have scientifically proven our African origin. Psychology calls this disassociation. It's a defense mechanism that evolves to put a distance between themselves and the white society's negative depiction of Africa that brings them immense shame. All long-term demoralizing psychological warfare campaigns leaves damages to their targeted populations. This propaganda campaign also prevents African Americans from pursuing the reparation debt that the U.S. government still owes us. This is because it causes many African Americans to perceive the enslavement of our ancestors as being more of a rescue mission. It rescued us from the terrible place of Africa. It makes us perceive the brutal Holocaust of our ancestors as being a rescue mission, which benefits a system of white supremacy. To further manipulate African Americans to think in ways that benefit the white society, white historians rewrote the history of the African slave trade to favor themselves. Their revision intentionally makes the white invaders appear more humane and shifts the blame of the African slave trade more greatly upon Africans. The history of the African slave trade taught to African American students deliberately hides the brutal massacre of countless millions of African warriors that died in battles trying to rescue their loved ones from the slave ships. As the African warriors charged the beaches, the ship's crews shot cannons and bullet rifle holes into their bodies, leaving thousands of blood-soaked black bodies laying on the shores of the African beaches. The number of Africans that died in battle fought against the white invaders far exceeded many times over the number of any Africans that assisted them in the slave trade. The hiding of these fierce battle and these massacre has been deliberately done to perpetuate the lie that most enslaved Africans were fairly sold away. Critically think and ask yourself this question. If Africans originally owned all the natural resources, all the gold, diamonds, oil, minerals, and Western money had no value whatsoever in Africa, and the West had nothing that Africans needed, how then could the majority of the millions of slaves have been purchased? What possible commodity did the white invaders have, and they had in such they had great value, and they had in such high possessions of and abundance of that they could use to purchase the majority of the millions of enslaved Africans? And why wouldn't the greedy white invaders maximize their profit by using their weaponry advantage of guns and cannons to kidnap and steal most of the enslaved Africans? Once you start critically thinking and looking at the facts as they truly were, it becomes clear that most of the enslaved Africans were not fairly purchased and sold away. The history of the African slave trade, we've been taught, has been whitewashed to manipulate the minds of African Americans to think in ways that benefits the white society. This is the truth of our plight and condition. The white society exploits the monopoly over information that we receive to shape our minds in ways that serve the interest of their society. Those of us who are ignorant, insist that our minds have been shaped by slave syndrome myth. The slave syndrome would actually present what would be the least effective method used for controlling generations of people. That's not how you control people. The truth of our plighted condition is the white society deploys an ideological subversion system that conditions our minds to think in ways that serve the white society. African Americans have been deliberately brainwashed to think in ways that protect and serve the white society. This is not some feeble attempt of absolving ourselves of our own responsibility by wrongly blaming white people, as so many of you have been brainwashed to respond. This is the absolute truth of our current plight and condition. And as the ignorant ones are totally clueless of what has truly been done to us. The African American culture changed 180 degrees in ways that are against our interests, our own interests, and in ways that are beneficial to white society. It's always by deliberate design whenever the culture of the oppressed changes unnaturally 180 degrees in ways that are against our own interests and in ways that benefits our oppressors. Our oppressors have deliberately did this to us. It's never a normal occurrence when the minds of the oppressed aligns with the needs and the objectives of the oppressors. We must wake up to our reality. Because if our understanding remains flawed, then all liberating remedies that stem from our misunderstanding will also be flawed. The white society has deployed an ideological subversion system against us through their monopoly over information that we receive. Those who insist that we are controlled by a slave syndrome are ignorant. Whenever people are ignorant, they always believe nonsense. But we must understand that a white society deploys disinformation to keep our minds in ways that serve the white society. We must wake up to our reality. We must wake up to our reality. One love and peace.